Hi everyone, welcome to this Carcanet event tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very happy to welcome you to launch a new Carcanet classic. We are launching 100 Poems by Umberto Saba, as edited and translated by Patrick Worsnip, and the book also includes an introduction by Angela Leighton, and that is published this month, so thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over shortly, but I'm just going to run over some housekeeping with you. So as usual, we're going to be together for an hour this evening. Please do find the chat box, let us know where you're watching from, let us know what you think of the readings throughout the event. It'll be great to hear from you during this Zoom event. When you're using the chat, please make sure that you set the button to everyone. It'll automatically say hosts and panelists, but everyone won't be able to see each other's messages unless you select everyone, so please do that. Now, Patrick is going to read from the book for us tonight. While he's reading, I will have the text up on screen as a bit of a visual guide. If you need to rearrange the screen or anything like that, just have a play around, you're in control. But any technical problems, just drop them in the chat as well, and we'll try our best to help you with them throughout the event. Now, we're also joined by Emanuela Tandello. She is going to have a conversation with Patrick about the book in a little while after the reading, and there will also be time for audience questions. So as well as finding, excuse me, sorry. As well as finding the chat box, please can you find a separate button which says Q&A, and if you can get your questions for Patrick lined up in there, then Emanuela can put them to him later on in the chat. So without further ado, I think we'll begin. I'm very, very happy that we're joined by Emanuela Tandello, who is a fellow of Christ Church. She's taught Italian literature in Cambridge, London and at Oxford, and she specialises in modern and contemporary poetry. So it's a pleasure to have her here, and I'm very happy to invite her on screen to join me now so that we can begin.
Hello, I hope you can see me and you can hear me. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to introduce this this wonderful volume. I'm just going to say a few things about you know, Saba, and I will introduce Patrick, and then Patrick will read. The publication of this volume of 100 poems by Umberto Saba is a truly momentous event for the knowledge and dissemination of modern Italian poetry across the English-speaking world. And it is truly a privilege as well as a pleasure to have been invited to introduce it. It is not only a welcome event, but, if I may say so, a long-awaited one that contributes hugely to what Angela Leighton calls in her introduction the growing shelf of 20th century Italian poets in translation. May that shelf continue to grow bigger and richer. Umberto Saba, pseudonym of Umberto Poli, born in 1883 and died in 1957, is unanimously acknowledged as one of Italy's major poets tout court, and that is to say, not only of modernity. A fellow Triestine of Italo Svevo and a contemporary of his, and of course of James Joyce, who used to like to think of himself as a Triestine writer himself. Like Svevo, Saba came from a Jewish background. Like Svevo, he had an intense and conflictual experience with psychoanalysis. Trieste was indeed the entry point for Freudian discourse into Italy. He also entertained a conflictual love relationship with the Italian tradition. All Triestine writers who write in Italian write, as it were, from a border, away from the historic centers of Italian literature, like Florence, like Rome, Milan, with which he entertains an uneasy but infinitely fruitful dialogue. His canzoniere, from which these 100 poems are drawn, is an eminent example of this. It is a book that grew over the decades, from a first start as early as 1909 down to the 1950s. It is not an anthology, but a book that grows with the poet's own life and with his bio-stroke autobiography. As stylistic ancestry from Petrarch indeed to Leopardi, but also Heine and melodrama librettos, it represents a major, if highly unique and idiosyncratic embodiment of modernism. It is for this reason that its absence from the international horizon is so utterly glaring. There are translations of Saba into German, French, Spanish, but so far not in English. Now we have them. Thanks to Patrick Worsnip, that is now being redressed. So thank you, and thank you, Carcanet, for making this happen. The volume we're introducing today includes, as I said, 100 poems, and as Jazz said earlier, prefaced by an introduction by Angela Leighton, herself a poet very close to Italian language, culture, and literature. The volume also bears a most useful apparatus of notes to the poems, introduced by an eloquent and affectionate afterword by the translator himself. Patrick Worsnip, after working for many years for Reuter, is a profound connoisseur of Italy and a translator that in 2016 gave us an excellent translation of Propertius, that is also a Carcanet publication, incidentally, and who he tells me has actually translated the whole of Dante's Comedy. So we do await its integral publication very soon. One of the many virtues of his translation of Saba is that he successfully conveys his very particular rhythm and musicality by using rhyme, and perhaps we'll be able to talk about this later on, and metrical solutions. This is not an easy thing to do from one language into another. As you will hear, these translations actually sound like poems, and this is another crucial achievement for a translation. But enough of my comments. I'm now going to invite Patrick to read a selection of texts, and later we'll be able to converse with him and ask him about this, which was and is, I believe, a true labor of love. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Emanuela, and good evening, everybody, and thank you for taking part in this event. I'm going to read 8 poems altogether, with a few comments in between. They are going to be read in chronological order of their writing, with the exception of the first one I'm going to read, which comes from Saba's mid-career. And I'm reading it first because it's about himself and it sort of introduces his family background, which was so important to him. He had a Jewish mother and a Roman Catholic father who had converted to Judaism in order to marry Saba's mother, but who abandoned her even before Umberto was born and was subsequently referred to by his embittered wife as l'assassino, the assassin, or the murderer. So this is from a sequence of 15 sonnets collectively entitled Autobiography. This is the third. My father was to me the murderer until I met him when I was 20. Then I saw he was just a youngster and that the gift I have he gave to me. In his face he had my blue-eyed stare, a sweet and sly smile in his misery. He went about the world a wanderer. More than one woman loved and fed him freely. He was cheery and laid back. My mother felt the weight of all life's burdens. He slipped out of her hand like a football. She warned me, "Don't be like your father." I later understood in my own person, they were two races in an ancient quarrel. The next one is called Random Order, and it's from a volume he published early in his career called Military Verses. They were written while he was doing military service. And it's a slightly strange fact, in my view, that although he was born and lived in and was presumably a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which Trieste was part of at the time, he did his military service for Italy in Salerno, south of Naples, Italy being virtually an enemy of Austria. The title Random Order refers to a style of advance by a military unit. And I might just mention that Saba looked back with some nostalgia on his conscription period in 1908. And there's a story that on the day that he arrived in Salerno to start his military service, his fellow soldiers took him out to the cinema. Yes, they did apparently have cinemas in Salerno in 1908. And soldiers got a 50% discount at the cinema. He didn't qualify for it officially because he didn't yet have his uniform. But the other soldiers said to the cashier, "Oh, give him the discount, he's one of us." And this was one of the happiest moments, it seems, in Saba's life, who was very much a loner in his life and very much liked being called one of us. He enjoyed being considered part of a group. Anyway, random order refers to, random order is about a shooting exercise that he takes part in. If shooting, I flatten myself inside the thick wood, or where the path broadens out, I flee at a run. It's a wonderful game that truly gives the face of the world a different look. Think, there's a bush, there's a rounded rock that has to hide away my whole body. That which weighs most becomes almost weight-free. I mean the soldier with his heavy pack. Remember the bird entering the field of grain, then starting up, or the sheep bending low its knees, then seeming to fall right down. Today, my eyes see the earth as no artist ever saw it, I would say. Maybe animals see it in that way. Okay, the next one is to my wife. He considered it one of his most famous, if not his best known poem. We know this from a book he published late in his life. We have with Saba an almost unique situation that he wrote a detailed commentary on his own work and published it under an assumed name. To My Wife, he tells us, was written quite hurriedly when his wife was out shopping. And he presented it to her when she came back and was very surprised when she didn't at all like it. You can make your own mind up when you hear it as to whether you would like it if you were in her position. So, to my wife. You're like a young white pullet. Her feathers ruffle in the wind. She bends her neck down low to drink and scratches in the ground. But when she walks around, she has your step, queenly and slow. Over the grass she strides, full-chested and proud. She's better than the male. She is like all females of all the serene animals close to God's presence. So, if my eye and sense do not deceive me, these are your equals, not other women. When evening makes the little hens drowsy, they utter cries echoing yours, so gentle, those in which at times you complain of your troubles, not knowing perhaps your voice has the sweet, sad music of the hen coops. You're like a pregnant heifer, still free, without heaviness, frisky rather. If you stroke her, she turns about her neck, a soft pink tinging its flesh. If you meet her and hear her low, so mournful is that sound, you tear up grass to make a gift for her. That's how I offer my gift to you when you are sad. You're like a stretched out dog who in her eyes always has such gentleness and in her heart ferocity. At your feet she lies, looking saintly, her fervency unquenchably alight, watching you as she might her deity. When she trails you in the house or down the street, if anyone should dare to get close, she will bare teeth of gleaming white, and her love suffers from her jealousy. You're like the shy rabbit, In her narrow cage, she stands upright on seeing you and cocks her ears up high and rigid towards you, who bring her bran and chicory. Foodless, she shrinks into herself, seeking some dark recess. Who could take back from her that food, or take the fur she strips from off her body to add it to the nest where she'll be giving birth? Who'd ever make you suffer? You're like the swallow who comes back in the spring, but in the autumn she departs, and you don't have this art. Of the swallow, this is what you have, the agile way you move, and this, how when I was feeling and was old, you presaged another spring. You're like the provident ant. The grandmother with the child when they walk in the country speaks to him of her. And in the worker bee I find you, and in all females of all the serene animals close to God's presence, not in other women. The next poem is another very famous poem he wrote called The Nanny Goat, and I believe Emanuela will read this in Italian for you before I read it in English. So Emanuela, over to you.
Thank you. La capra. Ho parlato a una capra. Era sola sul prato. Era legata. Sazia d'erba, bagnata dalla pioggia, belava. Quell'uguale belato era fraterno al mio dolore. Ed io risposi, prima per celia, poi perché il dolore è eterno, ha una voce e non varia. Questa voce sentiva gemere in una capra solitaria. In una capra dal viso semita sentiva querelarsi ogni altro male, ogni altra vita.
Well, thank you very much, Emanuela. I don't think my English can match that Italian, but I've done my best with it. So here is La Capra in English, the nanny goat. I spoke to a nanny goat. She was by herself in the meadow on a chain. Stuffed full of grass, the rain soaking her, she bleated. That steady bleating chimed with my sorrow. And I answered, first in jest, then because sorrow lingers for all time, has one voice, does not change. The moan of this voice I heard then in a nanny goat left on her own. And I heard lamenting in a goat with a Semitic face, every other wrong, every other living thing. Now, one of the reasons why that poem has become very famous is the reference to the goat having a Semitic face, and some critics have assumed this to be a reference to the historic and universal sufferings of the Jewish people. Saba himself denied this and said that the reference to the goat's Semitic face was purely descriptive, but we may think that's a slightly disingenuous explanation. Right, next comes a poem called Three Streets. The city of Trieste, as Emanuela has already mentioned, was extremely important to Saba and really defines one aspect of his poetic personality, although he didn't indeed spend all his life there, and he had a rather complicated relationship with the city and with its authorities. But that's a question for perhaps another day. This poem describes three of the city streets that he was particularly struck by. Three streets. Trieste has a street that's my reflection when gloom and isolation fill long days. It's called Via del Lazzaretto Vecchio. Amid old identical buildings like hospices, there's one note, only one, of cheerfulness, the sea at the end of its side alleyways. Smelling of spices and of tar from the desolate warehouses facing it, it trades in netting and ropes for shipping. One shop has its emblem, a flag. Inside there, turn towards the passer-by, who rarely favors them with a glance, their bloodless faces prone over the colors of every nation. The women workers serve their life sentences, innocent prisoners darkly sewing the gay banners. In Trieste, which has sorrows aplenty and beauties of skyscape and landscape, there's a rise called Via del Monte. It starts off with a synagogue to finish in a cloister. Halfway up the slope, a chapel stands. There, the black rush of life can be surveyed from a meadow, and the sea with its ships, and the promontory, the crowd and the market awnings down below. Also, beside the rise, there's a graveyard, abandoned. They don't bury people or host funerals now, as far as I recall. It's the old cemetery of the Jews, so dear to my memory when I think of my ancestors buried after so much suffering and dealing in that place, all alike in spirit as in face. Via del Monte, the street of sacred affections, but the street of love and joy is still Via Domenico Rossetti, this green suburban neighborhood, which loses a little color day by day, always more city and less countryside, still keeps the fascination of its fine years, of its first scattered villas, of its trees in their sparse lines. A man who's strolling it on these last summer evenings, when the windows are open and each one's a belvedere, where someone sews or reads, waiting, might think that maybe here his darling would bloom again with the ancient pleasure of living, loving him and him alone, and the pink of health return to his small son. I might just say that Via Domenico Rossetti, the last of the three streets that Saba describes, was where the woman who was to become his wife, Carolina Wölfler, known in the poems as Lina, where she originally lived. And Saba identifies the man strolling on the summer evenings as himself in the commentary on his work that I referred to. Via del Monte was the site of the synagogue where he and Lina were married. The synagogue isn't there anymore, but there is a Jewish museum there. The next one is called Winter Noon. And it's one of my very favorite poems by Saba. In that moment, just when I was happy, God forgive me a word so vast, portentous, who pushed my short-lived bliss almost to tears. You'll say, some pretty creature who passed by and smiled at you. No, a balloon, a wandering turquoise balloon in the air's blueness, and my native sky never so resplendent as on that clear, cold winter noon. A sky with just a few white wisps of cloud, the house windows flaring in the sun, the thin smoke of one or two chimneys, and over all these things, God-given things, that globe that had slipped from a boy's careless hand. He for sure was weeping out his pain, his terrible pain amid the crowd. Between the stock exchange and the cafe, where I sat and watched with glistening eyes through the windows, now soaring and now dipping his pride and joy. I might just say that the cafe, which at the time Saba was writing, was called the Cafe Municipio because it was housed in the town hall, still exists, and is called the Piazza Grande because it's on a very large square in Trieste. And I have had coffee there, and I met a professor from Trieste University who was a specialist in Saba to discuss Saba's works, Professor Elvio Guanin. The next poem is one of a series of 5 that he wrote called 5 Poems for the Game of Football. and this one is called Goal, and the English word goal is actually used as the title of the poem by Saba. Everyone knows that Italians are mad about football, and this is, in my experience of Italian poetry readers, one of his best loved poems. During my researches into Saba and work on his poems, I made a couple of visits to Trieste, and I visited a bookshop, a secondhand bookshop that had once belonged to him. In fact, it was his main source of income for much of his life. And he had a business partner called Carlo Cerne, who, after Saba's death in 1957, continued to run it until he himself, Carlo Cerne, died in 1980, at which point it passed into the hands of his Carlo's son Mario, who still runs it. He's now over 80, and I visited the bookshop and made friends with Mario. And on one occasion when I was in there, a very elderly man came in and spoke for a few minutes to Mario and then left again. And Mario said, "That man's 92 years old, and that's the kind of person who goes to secondhand bookshops these days. Everyone else goes to the internet." And he also told me that the man who'd just come in had once been goalkeeper for the Trieste football club Triestina. I pricked up my ears, of course, and said, "Oh, is he the man who's referred to in this poem called Goal?" And Mario said, "Oh no, he's too young." Anyway, here is Goal. The goalkeeper, fallen in his last vain resistance, hides his face against the ground, not to have to see the bitter light. His teammate, trying to make him stand upright with words and hands, kneeling at his side, discovers that his eyes are filled with tears. The crowd, delirious all, look like spilling onto the pitch. The scorer's comrades in a circle throw themselves around his neck. Few moments so perfect as this are given under the sun to all who are consumed by hate and love. The other keeper has remained beside the unviolated net, but not his soul. It's just his body there alone. He turns a somersault in jubilation, sends kisses from afar. "At this party," he says, "I'm a guest too." Okay, so the last poem I shall read is called Ulysses. Actually, Saba wrote more than one poem called Ulysses and makes several other references to Ulysses in his poetry, and seems to have, in a sense, identified himself with Ulysses, who, for Italians, I think Emanuela would probably confirm this, is identified not quite so much with Homer's character in the Odyssey, or let alone with James Joyce, but with the figure who appears in Dante's Inferno, and tells his story about how, after having returned to his home island of Ithaca, he set out on a last disastrous voyage with a band of comrades to try to expand the field of human knowledge by navigating to the southern hemisphere, where he and his ship were swallowed up in a storm. Ulysses. In my young days, I sailed along the coastline of Dalmatia, island clumps where an occasional bird hovered intent on prey, rose above the water, covered with seaweed, slippery, beautiful as emeralds in the sun. When the high tide and night blotted them out, sails slid off to leeward, further out to sea, to escape their treachery. Today, my kingdom is that no man's land. The harbour turns on its lights for others. I am still pushed out to sea by my untamed spirit, my painful love of life. Well, thank you for listening to that. Just one final comment. There's actually, in my view, quite a similarity in Saba's style throughout his life. Unlike some other poets, for example, Salvatore Quasimodo completely changed his style halfway through his career. Saba very much continued in the same vein, and I think this poem, Ulysses, written I think in the 1940s, shows that he was still firing on all cylinders, really, whatever you think of my translation, in his 60s. Anyway, thank you all, and Emanuela, perhaps you'll carry on with the next part of the evening.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was such a treat. It is wonderful to hear such faithful and yet masterful translations of this this absolute master of Italian poetry. I have a series of sort of questions to put to you to get us going. Saba, as you rightly point out, and as Angela Leighton points out in her foreword, was quite a neglected poet. You know, in Italy, we tend to say that he's a poet's poet. In other words, much appreciated and loved by other poets. One of the poets who greatly admired him was Eugenio Montale, who of course was to go on to win the Nobel Prize in the late 1970s. And you couldn't have two more different poets. But Saba nonetheless, possibly also because of the kind of poetry we heard, you know, the beautiful To My Wife, A Mia Moglie, which shocked quite a lot of people when it was published. But so, you know, he sort of slipped off the radar quite often. And I'm just wondering how you came to discovering Saba and to becoming so passionate about his work that you decided to translate it.
Well, I did study Italian, including modern Italian literature, as a university subject. And I think I first came across him in an Italian bookshop, actually, when I was looking through the modern poetry shelf and came across the Canzoniere in the edition which has a dust jacket with the famous portrait of Saba by Carlo Levi.
Yeah.
And on an impulse, I bought it, and I thought, this poet is really for me. I mean, the first poets, I suppose, of the 20th century that I became familiar with were probably Quasimodo and Montale. But compared with them, I mean, of course, they're fantastic poets, but Saba sort of was someone who really, I felt, reached out to me. I mean, he was someone who was sitting in me, you know, in the cafe, you know, at the bar, you know, touching my arm and sort of telling me about his family and himself. Whereas the Hermeticists, such as Quasimodo and Montale, I mean, writing about themselves was really not what you did. So I felt there was this kind of human contact with him that was perhaps a bit lacking with some of those others. And that was, I think, what first attracted me to him.
Yeah, and it's certainly, you know, his apparent simplicity is something that that can disarm, and certainly when we introduce him to our undergraduates, you know, they remain a little puzzled by the fact that even if they are beginners, they can actually understand what is being said. But of course, they also discover how deceptive that simplicity can be when it comes to, you know, writing commentaries about it. I wanted to ask you about this simplicity. because it is both linguistic and in a sense it is also formal, because of the way in which he makes use of the Italian tradition. There was a question by Michael Schmidt, if I may answer quickly, who wanted to know whether the poem to his wife is in rhyming free verse, and did he always rhyme even in free verse? Well, the point is that what he does, he plays with the form of the canzone, which is something that he inherits not only from Petrarch, but also from another wonderful Italian poet of the 19th century this time, and that is Giacomo Leopardi. And he introduces his own form of the canzone. So you don't have a regular rhyming scheme as you would, but he makes use of rhythms of the Italian poetry that are immediately recognizable. And something else that he does is latch on to the musicality and the canzonetta of Italian melodrama, which is the form of poetry that humble people, the uneducated in Italy, actually cultivated, and that they knew and that they learned by heart because they would sort of hear it. So there is this is not easy to translate, is it?
No, it's not. I decided that right at the start that, contrary to the practice of others who've attempted to translate Saba, I mean, I wouldn't fall into just the sort of default free verse that they did, and would have at least a shot at representing the form. But I felt I couldn't do it entirely strictly. I mean, some of the poems are strictly rhymed, like the sonnets, for example. Yes. And I've made quite a lot of use of half rhyme, para rhyme, or whatever you want to call it. And my meter is not so regular as his. And this perhaps is notable in a poem like To My Wife, where the whole metrical scheme is much more complicated anyway. So I've sort of attempted a compromise solution in which there is some rhyme, quite a lot of half rhyme, and I've attempted a sort of iambic rhythm in a lot of the poems. But I felt that to try to do it exactly according to the rhyme scheme and metrical scheme that Saba uses would take me too far away from the sense of what he was writing.
Yeah. Thank you. I have one last question before we sort of open the questions to the audience. Of course, this is a huge book, and it is a very brave thing to select as you have done. Had you had the opportunity of including more? And maybe you did. Maybe you have translated. Sorry about the dog barking. Maybe you have translated more. You probably have, but in the end, you decided not to include it. But if you were to, which parts of this wonderful book would you want to add?
That's a hard one to answer. I mean, there are some poems I don't particularly like his longer poems. There's one called L'Uomo, Man.
Yes.
And there's another one called Brahma, or La Brahma, Desire. I don't think they really come off, or at least they don't work for me. So I probably wouldn't go for those. But I think I could easily, well, I say easily, I mean, it would have taken me a long time, but from the point of view of choosing poems, it wouldn't have been hard to do 200 because, there are so many wonderful poems there, along with some which are, are flops, as he himself recognizes. And I think they would be taken fairly evenly from his his best books, which I think are probably Trieste una donna, Trieste and a woman, and Parole, words, and some of the other volumes, which I think are really among his best. So I think they would probably be scattered throughout his career.
Yes.
Again, there's one or two books I don't think I like quite so much, like I think the Prelude and Fugues, though some people admire them very much. But I mean, to me, that, you know, the poems which really grab me are those in which, you know, he observes something around him in Trieste or in his family life and manages to universalize it, and really sort of reaches out to you. Those are the important poems to me, and there are many of those. He wrote, I think the Canzoniere contains over 400 poems actually, and then there was a so-called apocryphal Canzoniere, poems which were either excluded or never included in it or never published in his lifetime. Some of those are, as one would expect, not terribly good. Some are quite interesting. I didn't include those in this particular one, partly for copyright reasons, because the copyright is held by a different Italian publishing company. So I think it wouldn't be hard to choose, you know, more poems, and it would be distributed throughout his writing life, I think.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I wonder whether we might turn to questions from the audience. So there's a question from Michael Schmidt. What is the place of his fiction, Ernesto and others, which is now published in the States, originally by Carcanet? Is it important or ancillary? He is being queered?
Well, Ernesto, I think it is an important book. I mean, I think I mentioned in the afterword of the poetry book that it's a bit like E.M. Forster's Maurice, insofar as it treats a gay theme, as we would now say, and was not published in Saba's lifetime. In fact, I do have a copy of his prose works published, I think, in the 1960s after his death, but edited by his daughter, Linuccia, who says that she wasn't sure still, even then, what his intentions were about this novel, and consequently she didn't include it in his collected prose works, although it was, of course, subsequently published in Italian and has been translated into English. I'm sure most people won't know much about this book. It's about the homosexual and heterosexual initiation of a 16-year-old youth in turn of the century Trieste. It was unfinished, and it reflects a sort of homoerotic side to Saba, which comes out also in a few of the poems. I didn't actually include any of them in this selection, not for any reasons of censorship, but simply because I only had 8 poems to read. But there are several poems with names of young men. Guido and is one of them, and there's a series of poems addressed to a young man he calls Telemachus, who was, in fact, his real name was Federico Almanzi, and he was someone that Saba obviously had a crush on. I did a couple of years ago speak to Saba's then legal heir, a woman called Raffaella Acetoso, who has since died, but who told me that she believed that Saba was bisexual. So I mean, it's kind of interesting, you know, if you believe that a writer's life is important to understanding his works. whether it's a great novel, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting novel. I'm not sure I would call it a great novel, but it's certainly interesting. And I believe it's his only use of Trieste dialect. I mean, not for the description, but for the dialogue in the novel.
Thank you. Yes, if I may sort of add something to this, I think Ernesto is actually quite an important book. And it's very interesting to see the way in which it dialogues with the poetry, and one of the sections of the Canzoniere that actually approaches his own homosexuality and his desire is as I prigioni, which is in the form of sonnets. And it's very interesting to see how, you know, prose and what we can consider an ancient form of Italian poetry actually dialogue with each other and approach the subject in different ways. I think when Saba was writing, homosexuality was not acceptable, and of course, it had been banned by the fascist regime, so it was a difficult position to be in. We have some other questions. So a fellow classicist, Anthony Holden, asks whether Saba has much in common with Propertius.
I would say not much that I can see, but I mean, he has this in common. I would say that, like Propertius, he was overshadowed, at least outside of his own country, by another poet. I mean, Propertius was overshadowed, or has been overshadowed in modern times, by Catullus. Everybody wanted to translate Catullus, and no one was interested much in Propertius, which was why I decided to have a go at him. And Saba has very much been overshadowed, I think, certainly in the English-speaking world, by Montale, who is much the most popular of the 20th century Italian poets, certainly in this country and in America, and has attracted, very famous English-speaking poets such as Robert Lowell and Edwin Morgan and others to translate his works, whereas the same didn't happen to Saba. I mean, I in translating poets, I always try to sort of get inside the head of the poet and try to express their personality. And I tried to do this with both Propertius and Saba, but I wouldn't. I mean, Saba was. I mean, as a man, he seems to have been a bit of a misery, and sort of curmudgeonly kind of character, which comes out in quite a lot of his poems. I wouldn't say that of Propertius, who seems to me quite a sort of lively character, much more so.
And if I can add a little anecdote, which comes to us through the poetry of another very major Italian poet, Vittorio Sereni, belonging to a different generation, who was a great admirer of Saba. And he tells this story. He found himself as a very young poet waiting to see the publisher. And Saba was there as well. And they'd been kept waiting for quite some time. Suddenly, sort of Saba stood up and sort of, banged his stick on the floor and said, in Triestine dialect, "El poeta d'Italia non spetta." The poet of Italy does not wait, will not wait. He's well known for having had a fairly spiky character, and also perhaps not an inflated notion of himself, but certainly he was aware of his greatness. We have a question from Caroline Maldonado. Are any of the original poems written in Triestine dialect?
The answer to that is no. Yeah. But as I say, I think his only venture into dialect was in this novel Ernesto, and then it appears in the dialogue, but not the novel itself is not written in dialect.
That I'm trying to sort of keep an eye on both the Q&A and the chat, and there have been some interesting points made about Ernesto that actually was filmed, and you can actually find it on YouTube. Thank you very much for that information, because I did not know that had been done. So I will immediately go to YouTube after we've finished talking and have a look at that film. I wonder whether there are any other questions from the audience. The thing about dialect is an interesting one. Both Saba and Svevo and their contemporaries would have spoken Triestine at home and outside the home. It is well known that Joyce actually learned to speak Triestine. That this is something that you know, that still happens in Italy today, where you have a strong dialects with an element of prestige to them. So, you know, if you go to Venice, you know, people speak Venetian, they don't speak Italian to each other most of the time, and it goes right across, you know, the social strata. And so it's interesting that you know, he certainly does not write in Triestine. He wants to write in Italian, just as Vevo wants to write in Italian and not in German, which was his first language. And there's another wonderful poet called Biagio Marin, who comes from Grado, which is a little peninsula south of Trieste. And he was asked, you know, well, you know, why don't you, why are you writing in dialect? He's a dialectal writer, a poet, and he said, do you speak dialect in your everyday? And his reply was, what, the language of poetry? So there's an interesting relationship between dialect and the language of poetry, and of course the language of tradition. And you won't be surprised to hear that what is known as the Sabian line, the linea Sabiana, goes right across many writers, many poets from the 1970s who are known as neodialettali or neovolgari, who learn Saba's lesson, but nonetheless write in their own dialect. There's Anthony Barnett, who points us to an article surveying all the translations of Saba. Thank you very much. Thank you. And then there's a question about psychoanalysis and Saba. What about psychoanalysis?
There's a famous story that Saba was once asked what political party he belonged to, and he said the Psychoanalysts Party. But he suffered for most of his life from what we would now call depression, but what he refers to, you know, in historical terms as melancholy. And he was treated by a psychoanalyst called Eduardo Weiss, who like him, was a Trieste Jew and had studied in Vienna with the also Jewish psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. And Saba went to him for a long time, as far as I know. It's, I think, the sort of psychoanalytical side to his writing that has convinced critics that he is a true modern, because the question has been raised whether he really is a modern, in view of the fact that he sets himself up in the tradition, you know, going back to Dante and Petrarch, and uses these traditional forms of verse, and so on. And if you read Montale or Ungaretti or Quasimodo, I mean, they look, you know, modern in a way that he doesn't, you know, because they're very difficult and he's rather simple, you know, relative, you know, deceptively simple perhaps. I mean, Professor Guagnini, who I referred to as having met in this cafe on the Piazza Grande, said he believed that this aspect to Saba was a sign of, you know, his modernity, that he was, you know, obviously of a completely different century from, let's say, Carducci, you know, one of the greats of the 19th century, who was only writing a few decades before Saba, but might as well have been writing eons before him. I mean, if you compare their work.
Thank you. Michael asks, how does Saba compare poetically with Pavese? And he mentions the narrative elements, the plainness, both being novelists, though Saba less than Pavese. So what about Pavese?
Well, I have to say I'm not a great expert on Pavese, and what I read of him, I think there is a certain similarity, but I mean, and the points that Michael mentions are true. But I think, you know, Saba is, as I mentioned in the book, a kind of sui generis poet. I mean, he's kind of unique and completely different figure from anybody else that I can think of in Italian literature, Italian poetry. He does, I think, bear some superficial similarities to Pavese, but ma non tanto, you know, not so much. Perhaps you'd care to say something, Emanuela, because I'm sure you're better read in Pavese than I am.
I think there is one major book by Pavese, which is Lavorare Stanca, toil, labor is tiring, which was really quite revolutionary. But it is revolutionary precisely because it introduces a very long line that is very similar to a narrative line. Personally, I don't see much resemblance between the two, and I don't really think that Pavese was an admirer of Saba, but, you know, I have to confess that it's a question I've never sort of asked myself. I think we probably need to wrap up and thank Patrick very, very much indeed for his reading and for his insight into this wonderful poet. Read his translations and read Saba. He's wonderful. And thank you very much indeed to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody who took part.
Thank you guys so much. It's been a real pleasure to hear you discuss the Saba and the poems, and thank you for the reading as well. It was great to hear the Italian. Yes, it's been such a pleasure this evening. Thank you guys for your comments in the chat. It's been great to read them, and thank you for your wonderful questions. I did put the link in the chat for you. There's a discount code for you to buy a discounted copy of the book. Please do that. If you can't do that right now, check your emails tomorrow, and it'll also come as an email, and all the info is there. So get in touch with us if you have any problems about getting a copy of the book or anything else. Finally, I just want to invite you again to join us next time. Our next launch is a week today, on the 29th of June. We're launching Ian Popel's new and selected poems, and he will be in discussion with Evan Jones. So the link is in the chat as well. Check the website, get in touch with us if you have any problems. So that's everything. Thanks again. Congratulations, Patrick, on publication. And thank you, Emanuela.
Thank you.